while on Cumberland Island conducting my research, I was assigned and was interested in why do the boundaries between plant communities move, and why do they move so rapidly? What regulates the establishment and maintenance of one plant community compared to another? So I decided the relevant plant communities to work on, the boundaries between them, were oak forests. So there's this live oak forest there, dominated by Quercus virginianus, which is a scientific name, with Spanish moss hanging off of these beautiful large trees. And in some places, there was a relatively sharp boundary between the oak forest here and the freshwater marsh here. So freshwater marsh, notice this is a barrier island, so it's out in the ocean, out in the Atlantic Ocean. But there was this lens of fresh water that provided drinking water for the people who live there, and also habitat for freshwater organisms. Anyway, the boundary between the oak trees here and the marsh, the freshwater marsh here, was relatively facile. It would move over relatively short periods of time, as indicated by remote photography, airborne photographs taken on at relatively short intervals. Now, there was also this plant community called scrub, dominated by ericaceous plants. And that's very similar to ericaceous, meaning in the Ericaceae family. And that's a plant community that you can find in places like chaparral, California chaparral or Arizona chaparral. And in Europe, they call it by another name that I forget now, but in a relatively large-scale sense, there is this scrub plant community that is dominated by a bunch of woody plants that don't get to tree height. In any event, the boundary between the oak trees, the tall, statuesque oak trees, and the scrub, as we called it, was also relatively dynamic. Why could that be? Now, Susan contacted me because of two reasons. She thought I had expertise in fire ecology, which I did, because that's why I went to graduate school. And because I was getting a degree in range science, she assumed I had an understanding of grazing, whether it's livestock grazing or other animals grazing, invertebrates for that matter. It doesn't really matter. She just thought that that factor, the livestock, probably was contributing to the movement of these boundaries between plant communities at a relatively short period of time. So I did a bunch of research, a bunch of historical research, looking at aerial photographs, looking at changes in water depth over time, and concluded, without doing an experiment, without having the ability to do an experiment, because we just didn't have time to actually identify this as the causal factor, I determined that probably the story could be explained by relatively large-scale, short-term and long-term weather patterns, most notably precipitation. So this freshwater lens that was under this island, under the surface of this island, if it came up a little bit from a series of wet years, then that would favor the marshes, and the abundant number of oak trees that died coincident with that increase in precipitation indicates that the oak trees were not well adapted. They were suffering from physiological drought or not getting enough oxygen to their roots. So that probably explained why the oak trees were dying. And it was a similar story with the boundary between the oak trees and the scrub. The scrub was better adapted to rapidly altering groundwater conditions than the oak trees were. So that's the short version of that story, which, as I think about it, wasn't very short. But anyway, Susan Bratton, at the time, was in the process of transitioning from a professor in plant ecology and more generally a professor and Cooperative Park Studies unit leader in ecology, very generally stated, because she supervised postdocs and graduate students and worked with faculty who were studying animals as well as plants. She was in the process of transitioning to a religious studies professor position, and that's what she does now. She had been reading multiple versions of the Bible, the Christian Bible, in its various forms, and she was also she would be considered a very spiritual person. And so she was in the process of making this transition. It was shortly after I received my postdoctoral status with her that she went on to become a professor of religious studies, and I suspect she's still doing that work. Anyway, I didn't last very long in the postdoc because I was offered a professor position. So I went to Texas A&M University as a visiting assistant professor. It was a 2-year position with potential, if I served well enough, to turn into another 2 years. So visiting assistant professor, and it had a relatively large teaching load. That large teaching load was pivotal for me. One of the classes I was teaching had 400 students, about 150 in the morning class, the 9 a.m. class, and about 250 in the early afternoon class, because nobody wants to get up at 9 o'clock in the morning when they're a college student just to go to a class. So twice a day, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I'd be, for an hour, 50 minutes, I'd be facing 150 to 250 students. And there was this unspoken rule at Texas A&M University that you pick up the daily campus newspaper on the way into class, and if the professor is not holding your interest, you just pick it up and start reading. And there are a few things that provide more motivation to capture the attention of your students than staring up at 150 newspapers. So that's when I learned to become, that's when I would learn to develop my act in stand-up tragedy. Because what I was telling with respect to environmental stories was tragedy. So I received my PhD in 1987, went in late 1987 to the University of Georgia and spent most of my time there actually on Cumberland Island. Drive 6 hours down to the coast, spend 2 or 3 weeks on Cumberland Island collecting data, collecting samples, drive back up, spend a week or so analyzing the data collected to this point. And then in spring of 1988 was offered the position at Texas A&M University. It's pretty interesting because as I was wrapping up my PhD research, I thought, I really want a job that is either working for the federal government or for the university as a professor. And I'll take that job anywhere in the United States except the South. I had this aversion to the South that was rooted in prejudice because I'd never spent any significant amount of time there. And so then what happens? I do my postdoctoral research in what almost anybody would consider the Deep South, Athens, Georgia, and Cumberland Island in extreme southeastern Georgia. And as I'm there, I'm thinking, okay, I need to be more specific. The South isn't so bad after all. At this point, I'm willing to take any professor position as long as it's not at Texas A&M University, because I'd received my master's and PhD degrees at Texas Tech. Texas A&M was the big rival, so I didn't want to go there. I just had this deeply seated, unfounded hatred of Texas A&M University. And so, of course, that's where I was offered the faculty position, my first professorial position. So, wrapped up the postdoc position in spring of '88, went to College Station and Texas A&M University in late 1988, August probably, to prepare for the semester. and then spent the fall of 1988, spring of 1989 working there, and then as of May 1st, 1989, began working at Tucson, Arizona, at the University of Arizona in my first tenure track position. So one academic year in this visiting assistant professor position. Before that, a few months, maybe 8 or 9 months altogether, working on postdoc. And before that, the PhD and master's that I wrapped up in 4 years, 4.5 years altogether for both of those degrees. So then I started May 1st, May 1st, 1989 at the University of Arizona, and stayed there for 20 years with various disruptions along the way. So I left active service on the campus of the University of Arizona May 1st, 2009. And I chose that day specifically because just in the rest of the world, with the glaring exception of the United States, May 1st is the day we honor and celebrate workers. 20 years at the University of Arizona. So to circle back, I'm not a climate scientist. I call myself a conservation biologist because from the time I started working on my master's degree at Texas Tech University and all the way through that master's degree and my postdoc and my time at Texas A&M and my time at the University of Arizona, I was interested in conservation biology. Now there was no degree and really no existence academically of conservation biology in 1987 when I received my degree at Texas Tech University, my PhD degree. In fact, it was 1987 that the Society for Conservation Biology was established, and I believe it was 1989 when they published their first journal called Conservation Biology. So I didn't know about the existence of a formal organization because there wasn't one of any significance. So I didn't call myself a conservation biologist when I graduated with my PhD degree from Texas Tech University. However, at the time, the Range, Wildlife, and Fisheries Science Department at the Texas Tech University had this really interesting mix of people from all over the world. There were graduate students from Africa. There were graduate students, there was some sort of pipeline that went from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point straight to Texas Tech University. So I worked with all these interesting characters from all over the world. And there was a significant influence of the Nature Conservancy at the time as well. And one of my best friends, who I spent many, many thousands of hours in the field with, was a guy named Jeff, who worked for the Nature Conservancy before going back to get his master's degree. And then he worked for the Nature Conservancy afterward too, and I suspect he's still working for the Nature Conservancy somewhere in Texas. Although he's from Wisconsin when he came to Texas.